I'm Connor Wold, and welcome back to another episode of More Than Kurosawa. And this week we're going to be looking at the film Knockoff by director Tsui Hark. Despite being a Hollywood movie, I think is still an Asian director and a quintessential example of an Asian director going Hollywood and making an Asian movie just with Hollywood movie stars. Really excited to talk about this one this week. But if you're new to the series, what I do every single week is discuss a different Asian movie by a different Asian director to help us understand the wide world of Asian cinema, to showcase that there is more than Akira Kurosawa and more than Bong Joon-ho. I find that a lot of us maybe check out some Asian movies and only check out a couple directors, but there's so much more. In particular with this series, looking at East Asian cinema. We've been doing this now all the way since the end of the last Oscar season, so back in March, now up until today, talking about so many great directors, so many great movies, a different director every single week, a different movie every single week. I always like to use these movies as well as a good starting off point to learning more about directors that maybe you've heard about but haven't done a deep dive into. So definitely all these movies are high recommends on my part, and also the directors in many ways. While I don't love necessarily all of them, there's always at least one or two movies that I really do appreciate and want to celebrate them to help us understand the different types of East Asian movies. And this is going to be the second last episode of this series. Next week, we're going to be doing the last episode because we're going to start back up into this channel's flagship series, Old Oscar Countdown. The Oscar season is back. Excited to talk about what I think is going to be a great Oscar year this year. Very unpredictable, but I've seen a lot of the movies, so I think that will give me a bit of an edge. So if you're a fan of my Oscar content, wait a couple more weeks until that comes out. And if you're a fan of this series, we've done a whole bunch of other videos, so check out the ones that maybe you haven't seen. And just want to give a big thank of support for everyone that has been supporting this series and leaving their comments down below of how much they've been enjoying it, or any kind of comments or suggestions or things. I've really been appreciating it so far. Next week, still one more episode, but just did want to give a bit of an announcement in terms of how we're planning things going forward. But if you're also still new to the series, we essentially break down these videos into two parts. The first part talking about the discussion of the filmmaker, why I wanted to cover this filmmaker, because we cover a new one every week. And then the second half discussing the film, why I think it's interesting, why I think you should check it out, and how it's a kind of representative film of the director's career and where it was in their point and in their history. So transitioning now into the first part of the video, why I want to cover this filmmaker, Tsui Hark. And it's because I think he is one of the most original directors maybe in movie history. I think he is genre defining in his contributions to what I think of, and I think a lot of people think of, as a martial arts movie or a wuxia film. The closest director that we've covered so far would be someone like a Zhang Yimou, but Zhang Yimou in the 80s and 90s were making more dramas and chamber pieces. Whereas it wasn't until the 2000s where they really started to do action-type, martial art-type movies. But with Hawk here, he started pretty much at the beginning, making movies in the 80s and 90s, starting off with those kind of fantasy martial arts movies with movies like Zoo Warriors from the Magic Mountain, and then going maybe a little bit more historical with his Once Upon a Time in China series. And even up until today, only a couple of years ago, he co-directed The Battle at Lake Changjin, which is the highest grossing Chinese movie ever. It made over $900 million at the box office. This is Oppenheimer money or Dune money or Despicable Me 4 money. Like, this was a huge movie, and he was a part of that. So he's in rarefied air in that he's been able to make kind of culturally defining movies for 4 decades. 5, I guess, if you 80s, 90s, 2000s, 10s, and then the 20s here. So while I don't love his more recent movies, they're a little bit more hit or miss for me. I think he's got a really great resume throughout that entire period, whether it be the Zoo Warriors movies or some of his more Hollywood movies, which we're going to be actually talking about later in this episode. Wanted to cover him because I think he's a genre-defining filmmaker and helped really craft and really influential for these kinds of movies. But the types of movies he makes are the way I would describe them as fantasy action movies or historical action movies. A lot of his stories, to me, make no sense or very little sense. I don't think he's totally interested in that. Sometimes there's kind of twists and turns and backstabs, but for the most part, Sometimes he's also interested in larger themes rather than individual characters. So he tries to pack a lot within a short period of time. But my joy and what I get out of a lot of his movies is the action sequences, is his action choreography. A lot of his movies feel like going from one action scene to another and kind of keeping up that momentum. Whether it be directly fantastical in the wuxia films, he definitely loves a lot of kind of special effects, or more historical, let's say, in the Once Upon a Time in China series. They do have a similar dedication to a lack of story and characters and interest, I think, in action, in fight choreography, and that's where he's fine-tuned and so well calibrated at being great at these action sequences, these fight scenes. They're very visually inventive. And the way he moves his camera within those action scenes are really interesting as well. So when I think about Hark, I think about his fantastical nature, whether it be directly in his fantasy movies, but even in the historical type ones, they feel like, fairy tale-esque. It's not a coincidence that's Once Upon a Time in China. That's one story in historical China. Even the way he puts his camera, oftentimes he'll has his signature very extreme low angle shot. So we see the sky sometimes in these really low angle shots make the heroes feel grander. Because he's not interested in story, I think he defines clear rules of good guys and bad guys, and there's no subtlety or anything going on there. So I think that makes sense, the way he shoots his characters, his heroes, from that low angle to make them feel more dominant. So whether it be the historical type movies or the regular fantasy movies, all his movies kind of feel a little bit fantastical because of his action fight style and the way people get punched and they are thrown across the style of the room. Almost kind of anime-esque, I guess, if you were to compare it to something else, but it's definitely in its own kind of a genre. If you think of like a Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, or Hero, another movie that we've covered, a lot of that has direct influence and ties back to a lot of Hawke's work. So fascinating, interesting, genre-defining filmmaker that I knew we had to cover on this series. But speaking about the film we're going to be covering today, Knockoff, this is a Hollywood movie that he did, starring, a big-time Hollywood star at the time, in Jean-Claude Van Damme, starring Rob Schneider, a big, American comedy star. And this is about a fashion designer in Hong Kong who switches out some of the shipment for the company he's working at with knockoffs, and they find out, and he has to go back and switch out the shipment before it leaves port, or else he'll lose out on millions of dollars and go to jail. And then where the plot goes from there is a little bit more sporadic and twisty and turny, and backstabs and double agents and triple agents and lots of fun stuff there. But like a lot of Hawke's movies, this is not something that I think you should worry about or care too much about, because what it is one of the most dynamically filmed action movies of the 1990s. But the reason why I wanted to cover it on this series is because, yes, it's not an Asian movie. It is a Hollywood movie, and we're trying to learn more about, Asian cinema. How come you included this, Connor? Well, I really do think it is an Asian movie. If you've seen a lot of Hawke's movies, of course, Hawke is an Asian director. A lot of his stylistic sensibilities are in this movie. It's set in Hong Kong. It has a lot of Asian supporting cast. So if you've seen this movie, it feels more like a Hong Kong movie than it does a Hollywood action movie. And I thought that was also important historical context, that if we're going to be talking about understanding the wide world of Asian cinema, it's not just Asian directors making movies in different languages, set in different countries, because there's a real strong pipeline between Asian directors going and doing Hollywood stuff. Most recently, we just saw the trailer for Mickey 17, Bong Joon-ho's most recent movie. So Bong Joon-ho wins Best Picture with an Asian movie, South Korean movie in South Korean. And then what does he do? He makes a sci-fi movie, space movie, a big Warner Brothers Hollywood studio movie starring Batman. I mean, that's the completely opposite side and completely just cashing in on that Hollywood cachet. And modern day filmmakers still do this, like a Park Chan-wook just had his series of The Sympathizer and has done movies in English as well. Same thing with, even talking about this kind of time period here with Hawke or John Woo or Ronnie Yu. There's a lot of these kind of Asian Hong Kong directors that merge to Hollywood. I think because there's a bit of an allure of Hollywood almost seeing as being the big leagues. I also think, though, especially during this time in the 90s, the budgets were there, where we could get way more money to do a lot of the stuff they were doing. I think that's probably why Hawk gravitated to it in the first place. And while he eventually went back to China, and I don't think a lot of his Hollywood movies are seen super favorably, I think they're some of the hidden gems of his career. And I think that because the increase in budget just gives Hawk so many tools that he hasn't really had in this period, and maybe got in more recently in his later period, but I think this was probably the prime of his career. So you got Hawk in the prime of his career with a huge budget, with all these amazing tools to his disposal, and he uses them. Of course, the first tool being that bigger budget, so you can have more extras, you can have different types of action scenes. This really is an elevation, I think, of Hawk's work, because usually in Hawk's other movies, it's a lot of fight scenes, it's a lot of hand-to-hand combat. Well, this one, you have hand-to-hand combat, yes. You also have gunfight scenes, which is another element. You also have car chases, so there's like another element on top of that, which I think makes it a little bit more dynamic and visually interesting, because we're not going from fight scene, punch, 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 to another punch, punch, punch fight scene. We're going from punch, punch, punch to maybe a race scene, to a car chase scene, to a gunfight. So there is different levels to this, so I think the budget really helps him. I think Van Damme is a really huge part to this movie. He's such a physical presence, and he seems and is so athletic, so he's able to do some of the stunts that Hawk desires of him, which I think adds to the realism of the movie. But I think the ultimate thing that the budget provided him is flexibility with camera angles and different ways to shoot scenes. He pretty much invented GoPros and drone shots in this movie before anybody else. 20 years before the GoPro, or I guess 20-ish or years before the GoPro really was existing, in at least or used in modern movies. I loved a movie in 2022 called Ambulance by Michael Bay. And that was great because it was so dynamic. They used a lot of drone shots. I was like, oh, this is so interesting. So it was fascinating to go back and see a movie like this in Knockoff and see in race sequences cameras mounted onto bikes or mounted onto these rickshaws, or having these almost drone-like shots without drones, where he would have a crane at the top of the building and you'd see an overhead shot and he'd crane down, and as he was craning he'd spin the camera, and it looks like this kind of drone shot that you'd see in a modern day movie. And even still in modern day movies, they don't always have this inventiveness in the camera work. So action scene after action scene, it's just some of the most creative, dynamic work that we're seeing. Classic Hawk shots of low angle, and you can see this guy behind him, but then also tilted wide angle lens, distorted kind of high angle shots of Rob Schneider in the Fashion Factory, or like I said, the rickshaw scene where we're attaching cameras to objects as they're moving. It's just really dynamically interesting. Hawk is able to have and play with all these different tools and all these different toys, and he utilizes it to great effect. I think this is really entertaining. The story makes absolutely no sense. It doesn't matter, because the action scenes continually are exciting and interesting, because you have this great combination of exciting director who wants to try new things and put cameras in different places, with a lead star in Van Damme who is athletic and can do a lot of what Hawk is demanding of him, combined with just a really tight kind of hour and a half, 40-minute action storytelling of everything being perfect in this 90s period, where so much of it is practical, so they're doing it for real. There's not a lot of necessary CGI, or the CGI you do see are pretty obvious. So you may think I'm crazy, you may think, Connor, this has got a 10% on Rotten Tomatoes. Should I really watch this movie? I think so. If you're watching, a typical blockbuster movie, you may be disappointed if that's what you want. But if you're interested in seeing a dynamically filmed, entertaining action movie, it's maybe also a movie that is helped after seeing some of Hawk's other movies, so you understand just how much of a movie it is defined by his filmography, down to the dialogue and the heavy use of ADR, and there is a little bit something off and foreign to it, but I think it's just almost an Asian movie in which they speak English, but everything else is very Asian about it, very Hong Kong. So one of the funnest discoveries of this series, and I generally think one of the most dynamically filmed and interesting action movies from the 90s period, up there with Speed and some of these other great 90s action movies. So definitely one that I think you should check out. So a 90s action movie starring Van Damme, Yeah, that's another example that when it comes to Asian cinema, there is more than Kurosawa. But that's about it, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you comment below. Let me know if you've seen this movie. Let me know if you think I'm a little bit crazy. Or if you haven't seen this movie, maybe check it out. I know they've got it on Tubi and some of the free ad-supported channels as well. So definitely a Sunday afternoon kind of a situation. I think Knockoff is a perfect kind of a fit for that. But stay tuned to next week where we're going to be covering the last episode for More Than Kurosawa, and then we're going to get back into the things for Old Oscar Countdown. Very exciting part of the year as we transition now for this channel. And once again, just want to give a sign of thanks from me for the amount of support that you guys have been giving me for this channel for the past 8 years or so, but particular for this series. It is always well appreciated. But that's about it. Until next time, stay tuned.